Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yoon Jung Park, and I am the program director of Georgetown University's Africa China Initiative. Thank you very much for joining us today for our first webinar of the spring semester. Today, we're going to be talking about Africa China engagements and preliminary impacts of Trump administration executive orders on tariffs and more. Um, Before I introduce our experts on our panel today, I wanted to say a very brief thank you to our funder, the Henry Luce Foundation, for funding all of our activities at the ACI, as well as to our event co-sponsors, Georgetown University's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and Howard University's Center for African Studies. A quick shout out to Brennan Young, our program assistant at ACI, and to our African Studies program director Laura Smith, as well as to Eleanor Albert of the U.S.-China Dialogue for their support, without whom we couldn't host these sorts of events. So again, thank you all for joining us. I see that the room is still filling, and hopefully we'll have more of you joining us. But we're very, very honored today to have three illustrious experts speaking to us about potential impacts to China, to Africa, and to their engagements in this new administration and these volatile times. We're joined by Yun Sun. She is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, she was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, jointly appointed by the Foreign Policy Program and the Global Development Program, where she focused on Chinese national security, decision-making processes, and China-Africa relations. Ho-fung is the Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Weisenfeld Professor in Political Economy in the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Hung's scholarly interests include global political economy, protest, and nation-state formation with a specific focus on China and East Asia. Finally, we're joined by our good friend and regular panelist, Dr. Bob Wekeza. He is director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, which he helped to establish in March 2018. Since 2015, Wekeza has been a senior lecturer at the Wits Center for Journalism, where he teaches and supervises international communications. His areas of teaching, research, and public engagement is international communication, the intersection of media and international affairs, and he's focused specifically on the relationships between Africa, China, and the United States. We're going to give each of our panelists between 8 to 10 minutes to make some opening remarks, and then the rest of this session is going to be run as a roundtable. I will moderate and ask some questions, and we'll do rounds of the panel. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn over first to Professor Hung, who's going to speak to us again for very briefly with some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Yun, for putting this very timely panel together and for inviting me to be part of it. So I'm going to be briefly talking about China's evolution, the evolution of China's engagement with Africa or global South in general, in the changing global political economy in the last 25 years. China engagement in Africa, of course, that we all know that date back to the Mao period and in the 60s and 70s that has a geopolitical kind of underpinning of it, and then trying to focus turn away from Africa in the 1980s and 1990s when China focused on reform and opening the domestic economy and export-oriented growth, eyeing the Western market, and then trying to start to re-engage or increase in engagement with Africa. Again, with starting with Hu Jintao's Back to Africa kind of initiative in the 2000s, and it coincided with China joining WTO in 2001. So in 2003, 2004, China start to be much more active in Africa in investing and this long program. But at that time, that the impetus for China engagement in Africa is really to lock in natural resources, raw materials, oils, and copper and iron to fuel China's booming economy, driven by the expanding export machinery after China joining WTO. So the structure is that there was a global free trade expansion at that time, and China become the workshop of the world to export varieties of finished export products to mostly U.S. and Western developed countries markets, and then China needs a lot of raw materials to propel the expansion of its manufacturing expansion. So it is the time when China lead a lot of resources from the global south, in particular in Africa. So China uh, start to increase in engagement of Africa again for its natural resources. And then it came the global financial crisis of 2008 that hit the China export machine badly. And we all very well that China rebounds successfully with its huge stimulus program in 2009, 2010, which is driven by loan and investment and fixed asset investment by construction. So China at that time built a lot of new airports and high-speed rail, steel mill, all kind of infrastructure you can think of, stadiums, real estate is another big item. So in 2009, 2010, and afterward, and China growth has been driven still by export growth, but also the investment becoming increasingly larger part of it. And then after 2010s and 2011, 2012, China kind of investment-driven rebound and growth taper off because they basically run out of things that is profitable to build, and there's so many railroad lines and airport and stadium you can build. After that, there's a lot economical to keep on building. So China economy start to slow down in the early 2010s and start to face an aggravating issues of overcapacities. And China need to look for outlet to export these spare capacities. China has very powerful machinery to build all kind of infrastructures. And then after they find that the demand for these infrastructures and construction is saturated in China, they literally look for somewhere else to build this stuff. And then the answer is the Belt and Road Initiative in 2000, starting in the Xi Jinping era in 2013, through China landing and concession loan and all kind of program to Africa, to other Belt and Road countries along the Eurasian corridor. China basically lend money to these countries, and these countries in turn use the borrow money to hire China contractor to buy Chinese steel and materials to construct the kind of infrastructures that they need, from stadium to railroad to highway to airport. So after 2010 or so, that China engagement with Africa and the developing world in general is more driven is driven less by the need for locking in raw materials because after the global financial crisis, the commodities price came down and oil price came down, and the need for locking into low cost raw materials and energy sources is less of a kind of urgent concern. But then exporting China's spare capacity and overcapacity in construction and infrastructure construction became a new priority for China engagement with Africa and the world. So it is the evolving the global economy that drive China two-stage, I would say, of engaging with Africa. And now we chart into a kind of got into a uncharted territory. It's not exactly uncharted. We have a first Trump administration. We know what it is, but this time it seems like the Trump administration is more confident and more capable of executing its vision about the world. So it is still too early to see what this tariff and also the cutoff of the U.S. aids to Africa and the rest of the world would stick or it will pass. But then imagine a world in which the Trump tariff prevailed against Chinese goods and many other goods. Then China export machine will face increasing difficulty, more difficulty, and also China issues of overcapacity will be more serious. And then China will feel more urge to export its spare capacity. And at the same time that we already see before Trump came into office, that is that different countries in the developing world trying to use tariff to slow down China export of steel and other more spare capacities already developing not only in developed countries but also South Africa, Brazil and Indonesia and many developing countries are already talking about tariff against Chinese steel and other products. So there's this China urge to export spare capacity is going to increase, and at the same time, the countries in developing world in Africa is going to be in a kind of a challenging situation to deal with this China increasing urge to export and this spare capacity. So we are in a kind of a very uncertain future. So I look forward to the discussion and the questions from the audience and to deepen the discussion about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hung. I'm going to turn now to Yun Sun.
Thank you, Professor Park. Thank you for the invitation to be here. So I think since we're covering how Trump administration is going to affect Africa, China, and also the relationship between China and Africa, I'll focus primarily on two issues that have emerged more frequently since Trump took over. The first one is foreign aid, and the question that we have seen in the field has been, well, U.S. is withdrawing its aid from the international community, especially with a tremendous impact over Africa. So is China going to fill the void? The second question I want to cover is critical minerals, because I do agree with Professor Hong that the Chinese economic priority in Africa has been an evolving case since I would say even earlier, since the Cold War period. But if you look at China's more recent engagement, the investment, that's not, the numbers don't lie. And if you look at the more recent investment, there is a clear tendency to maximize China's assets or China's equity in critical minerals in Africa. And that does pose a question, given President Trump's prioritization of the critical minerals. What does that mean? And how is that going to affect the relationship among the three parties? First, on the issue of foreign aid, on this question as for whether China can fill the void by the United States, just my straightforward answer is no, absolutely not. And here's why. If you look at U.S. government foreign assistance, well, before the most recent reform, or some would call the dismantling of the U.S. foreign assistance architecture, for example, in the fiscal year 2023, U.S. aid, the budget was 42 billion US dollars, including the largest category is 17 billion for governance, then 9 billion for humanitarian assistance, 7 billion for health and population, as well as another several other categories like agriculture, education, infrastructure. And U.S. aid is not the only implementing agency for foreign aid for the U.S. government anyway, because State Department also has a foreign aid or had a foreign aid budget of $18 billion. Department of Treasury, Department of Agriculture, each one of them has their own foreign aid budget, but much smaller. So if you compare the size of the U.S. foreign aid before the most recent reform to the level of Chinese foreign aid, I think the gap is just impossible to bridge. We all know that China does not publicize its foreign aid budget, but according to the 2021 version of the foreign aid white paper, the publicly announced figure was between 2013 and 2018, China's total foreign aid, everything counted together during those 6 years, the total foreign aid of China was 270 billion RMB. So if we use the exchange rate from 2015, so that whole 6 years of foreign aid budget is somewhere around 41.5 billion US dollars. And that averages to a little less than 7 billion US dollars every year. And during the same 6 years, the total budget of USAID was 229 billion US dollars. So that's about 38 billion US dollars each year. So if you compare the size, Chinese foreign aid during this period was 18% of the budget of USAID alone. And it does not even include the foreign aid from for State Department and other other government agencies. So the size, just the gap of the volume of the Chinese aid and the US foreign aid is impossible to bridge. And another issue that is critical when we compare or ask the question whether the Chinese can fill the gap left by, or what boys some would call, left by USAID, is what are the foreign assistance money being used for? So like I mentioned, US aid has been used for governance, humanitarian assistance, health and population. So let's look at what the Chinese aid is used for. According to formal government official documents from China, the Chinese foreign aid has 3 different categories: grants, zero interest loans, and concessional loans. And during the 6 years from 2013 to 2018, grants was about 47% of the total foreign aid budget. And that's what's being used for social welfare projects, humanitarian assistance, as well as capacity building, technical assistance, as well as material assistance. So that's more aligned with the traditional definition of USAID's aid budget, what it is used for. But it only occupies 47% of China's foreign aid budget, which means that more than 50% of China's foreign aid budget is used for loans. So what loans? Well, there's zero interest loans. And for us who work on Africa, we know that China's zero interest loans in the end, well, the expectation is that it will be forgiven. Both the, there's no interest, so the principal will eventually be forgiven. So that whole principle is counted towards China's foreign aid budget. And during those 6 years, it's about 4% of China's total aid. The largest category of China's foreign aid is concessional loans. And then again, for us who work on China-Africa, we know that it's not that the foreign aid money is used for the principal of the loans. The principal of the concessional loans are raised on the market by China Exim Bank, but the foreign aid budget is used to bridge the differences of the concessional loan interest rate and the commercial loan interest rate. That's what the aid money is used for. And that's more than 48% of China's aid budget, which means that the largest category of China's foreign aid is used to offset the differences of the interest rate between concessional loans and commercial loans. And that again means that while the majority of the Chinese aid money is not used in the traditional category of foreign aid as we here in the United States knows it. And that's another reason that for as long as China maintains its categorization or this pattern of its foreign aid distribution, the majority of the Chinese foreign aid is not used for what, for example, USAID money has been used for. And moving forward, given the economic slowdown that we have observed, given also the slowdown of the, I would say, China's foreign aid distribution and the volume in the past, basically since COVID, I think it is extremely unlikely, one, for China to significantly increase the size of the foreign aid, which was only 18% of US aid budget, anyway, and two, to significantly change the categorization, the distribution of the Chinese foreign aid to lean more heavily or primarily focus on grants, on capacity building, and on what USAID had been prioritizing. So I think based on these two factors, it's almost impossible for China to come in and fill the void. So does that mean that there's no impact over China? Well, once US withdraws from the space, it means automatically the weight that China carries, even with this limited aid, is going to increase, right? So without the United States, suddenly China becomes a bigger player in the room. But it does not mean that China will necessarily spend more money or allocate more resources for the purpose of aid. And I think that's something that Africa will have to bear in mind. And the second issue I want to talk about is critical minerals. And this is closely related to I think China's economic growth plan. We know that basically since during COVID, China has reoriented its export-oriented economy to focus on what they call the new three. The new three are what? They are solar panels, they are batteries, and they are electric vehicles, or EVs. So these three categories are representing the new growth category of China's export. And that's also where China has been placing most priority in terms of fostering and also government support. But these three categories also means what? It also means immediately that China's demand for critical minerals are increasing significantly because critical minerals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, rare earth elements, are vital for modern technologies from EVs to renewable energy infrastructure. And given the role that they play in the global energy transition, it has been prioritized as a key element of China's engagement with Africa in more recent years. And I think this is quite clearly reflected in the data. So if you look at how Africa's critical mineral industry is collaborating with China, for example, in the year of 2023, China's total economic engagement, so including loans, including investment, in Africa is calculated at 21 billion US dollars under the Belt and Road Initiative. And the estimate is that 8 to 10 billion of these engagements are focused on critical mineral projects. So you could see this significant reorientation of China's economic engagement in Africa, leaning towards critical mineral assets on the continent. And there are a couple of key projects. So $2 billion US dollars of acquisition of the Lumbabe copper mine in Zambia, $100 million investment in Mali for lithium, and another 137 million US dollars of investment in Mali on another lithium project in Mali. $1.8 billion in Botswana for copper mine, and another $2 billion in DRC for cobalt. So we're seeing that during COVID, the Chinese investment in sub-Saharan Africa significantly slowed down. And the previous model of infrastructure for resources, where resources for infrastructure was coming to a halt. But then in 2023, we start to see this sudden uptake of the Chinese economic engagement in Africa, and that's primarily, almost entirely driven by critical minerals. So in comparison, I would say the U.S. has been lagged behind. If you look at the data from Bureau of Economic Analysis, U.S. invested a total of $7 billion in Africa in 2023, but the investment estimated for critical mineral investment is only under $300 million US dollars. So that's 4% of US investment compared to China is almost 30% of the Chinese investment or economic engagement in Africa. So with President Trump's emphasis on critical minerals and the implication, especially for US national security, for US supply chain security, I think critical minerals or the competition between US and China over critical minerals assets in Africa is potentially going to be a more contentious issue. That potentially, you could argue, will put resources-rich countries in Africa in a advantageous position because they will be faced with enhanced competition from both great powers. But I think on the other hand, it's also going to put them in very difficult positions because I think there is a tendency from both Beijing and Washington to tell their partners that you have to make a choice. You have to pick a side, and it cannot be both. So that's a lesson that I think a lot of countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia have learned in the past number of years. And I see this potentially escalating in the case of Africa for the next few years. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yun, thank you so much for those really insightful comments. And I want to return to both those topics in our discussion. But for now, let's turn to Bob Wekeza. Dr. Wekeza, as I said, is I don't know, are you in Johannesburg or Nairobi?
I'm in Johannesburg now.
Good.
Johannesburg.
Yeah. And as I said in the introduction, the first and I believe still only Center for the Study of the United States in Africa. So he brings a very unique perspective. So Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Yun, and thanks colleagues as well as participants. Looking forward to an interesting discussion. I would like to frame my discussion around key pillars and key framings via which we can understand, or we can attempt to understand the new administration in the US and its impact on Africa-China relations. And I think this framing is one that where we start with, first of all, understanding the actors themselves. Of course, we talk of the actor theory in academic work. And in this particular respect, I think sometimes when we talk of Africa-China-US relations, or Africa-China relations, or Africa-US relations, we neglect the fact that we ought to start by understanding the key actors as they are, for who they are, and in their locale. So I think one has to, therefore, first of all, before getting into the impact of Trump's administration's executive orders on Africa-China relations, one has to understand the US. And I think there are many ways of understanding the US as it is now, before looking at US-Africa, US-China, US-China-Africa. And I think many discussions that have ensued after January 20th have seemed to suggest that the US is indeed a declining power. This is not a new narrative. I think many colleagues here will be familiar with Fareed Zakaria's thesis of, declining West. I think this is also Dambisa Moyo, nearly 15 years back, who actually came out with metrics demonstrating that the US was actually losing its economic, political, geopolitical power, and they detailed that. Many discussions that we've seen emanating from the continent right now, that is African, if we want to use the term African agency, Africans trying to understand the US in the current circumstances, kind of, see Trump as a personification or as emblematic of actually a declining US. That when you have a declining power, you have leaders who are demagoguery, who are basically, come around to shred norms of engagement that we know. And the drastic change in US domestic and foreign policy is essentially a demonstration of a power that is trying to stay afloat, that is trying not to kind of lose out in terms of what it has always been. So I think that is, I think from an African perspective, you look at the US as not necessarily, in fact, quite a number of leaders on the continent, people like Yoweri Museveni, people like Paul Kagame, people like Ramaphosa, who are practitioners, not because they're politicians, have said as much in the past. when there was a trade war between China and the US in 2018, 2019, particularly over issues to do with technologies, specifically Huawei, this leader said we do not necessarily need the US anymore. But of course, the pinch that the continent now feels from the loss of aid has actually gotten these leaders and thinkers and intellectuals thinking twice. But essentially, we are at a situation where that is one of the narratives. However, one has to say that the decline of the US, at least from an African perspective, is not being understood as a drastic fall. Just like the British Empire, just like the Roman Empire, it is a slow but downward spiral. Unless something drastic happens so that the US boosts its public goods provider role, its leader of the free world kind of narrative, its involvement in multilateral institutions that it helped to set up, which is now withdrawing from. And so I think that is, there could be many other perspectives on understanding the US as, from an African perspective. But this then leads to what do Africans see of China? Quite interestingly, it begins to look the same almost as it is with the African views on the US. And of course, this could be independent views, really. And I think because African intellectual scholars and so forth, if you look at the readings and the writings and the comments, do recognize that from about 2015, the Chinese economy that used to hit double digits for many decades was starting to go below 10%. In fact, the projections are that, at least by the World Bank, is that the Chinese economy's growth this year is going to fall below 5%. And in real terms, and I think my colleague Yun Soon mentioned this, we've seen that the big signature projects that China was involved in on the continent, the railways, the roads, the airports and buildings and so forth are not as frequent, are not as predominant as it used to be, putting paid to the notion that the BRI in Africa was a big was a big deal. Instead, what we see is more strategic investment by China in things like seaports and so forth to kind of secure sea lanes and so forth. And therefore, in fact, if you look at expectations from the African continent based on the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, we will have expected the continent, a dependent continent, to get well over 50 billion US dollars as the other FOCACs used to be. But this time around, the full package was 51 billion, which if you look at a continent of 54 countries, if you did a very simple, I'm not a very much a figures person like Yun Soon, but if you just divided 51 times 54, you'll get that every country will get less than 1 billion. It's not a lot, and of course, you're not even factoring in inflation and so forth. So the understanding therefore, and of course, one important factor that we must consider, at least from a geopolitical perspective, that on the African continent is no longer just China. We have United Arab Emirates, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Turkey, we have South Korea, we have Indonesia. There might be smaller, players, but they have also come into that breach. They have come into that space. So, and then of course, many African leaders, scholars, and so forth, who have kind of urged China to take on the US on their behalf. Dictators such as Museveni of Uganda, Afewerki of Eritrea, Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, have always come to the realization that China is not going anywhere near there. And therefore, the understanding that China is here for deals and so forth. There's talk of solidarity under the Global South or South-South cooperation, but China is not going to try to upset the current status quo, as it were, unless pushed. Even though it is the second largest economy in some circumstances, it falls way behind this falling giant called the US. And so from there, then you can begin to look at China, Africa, and US. And this will then suggest that Africans are going to essentially lean on China more for support, but they are not going to abandon the US. Why do I say so? In the recent fallout between President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa and Donald Trump, where there were claims getting into genocide, that there's a white genocide in South Africa, essentially, President Ramaphosa started off from a very strong position, kind of calling out Trump and Mark Rubio and even Elon Musk, who is originally from South Africa. But ultimately, we realized that South Africa has started reaching out to the US through backdoor diplomacy means, trying to mollify the US not to kind of cut aid and so forth. So we realize that now, even though South Africa has been a very close ally of China and remains so in the BRICS, it does realize the importance of the US, even though the US is not necessarily the big power it used to be, the absolute power it used to be. And therefore, Africans, almost going back to the Cold War narrative, are hedging their bets. They are looking both directions. And I don't think, even as Trump is quite serious about withdrawal of aid and so forth, African countries are going to still reach out to Washington, D.C. We have seen this, in fact, in some instances by leaders of countries such as Ghana, Kenya, and so forth, who are actually already in engagement with the U.S. We've seen the U.S. still playing a role in the DRC, where there's an ongoing conflict, whereas I think China is taken for granted. I think I'll try to wrap up at this point by saying that therefore here we could use the framework of change and continuity. And whereas some people imagine that in the China-Africa story, there's been more continuity than change, there's actually been lots of changes in the China-Africa relations. And these changes are evident, by the way, from what we've discussed so far, the kind of slowdown on big signature BRI projects, the realities of the Chinese economy itself, where in fact for the first time we are hearing of very concerning figures of unemployment by the Chinese themselves, and so forth. And I think the same story kind of figures in the US circumstance, where we again see continuity in terms of their institutions, their individuals, people in universities, and lots of the colleagues in universities are here, will remain above the kind of low levels of indictments and so forth that Trump has brought on. But at the same time, there's quite some drastic change in these withdrawals. And in fact, some people are beginning to look ahead 4 years from now, when perhaps there will be another change of leadership and we do not know what will happen. Maybe there will be repair there. I think I'll end by saying, increasingly, the narrative here is that Africans are thinking, doing away with this dependency mindset and try to kind of mobilize internal resources for their own development. A very difficult kind of task, but perhaps one on the table. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for some really thought-provoking opening remarks. I wanted to pick up on one of the things that Ho-fung mentioned. He started in toward the end of his remarks to talk about tariffs and the aim of tariffs being to especially tariffs targeted at China, aiming to slow China's growth engine. And you had mentioned other actors using tariffs in this way. So I was going to ask you if you would elaborate. And then second part of this question is kind of the opposite of tariffs. Programs like the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, that the US has had in place for many, many years now. And in Europe, there's a similar policy of everything but arms, which offers preferential access to US or European markets from Africa. I wanted to ask if you've seen anything or heard anything about those types of policies being stopped. So let me go back to Ho-fung, and perhaps Yun or Bob have any insights into AGOA and EBA.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Tariff is an interesting thing because first the Trump tariff that we did see it before against China in the first Trump administration, uh, and then the Biden administration kept all of it actually the tariff against China, and then the China response and China manufacturer respond against tariff. It's very well known that they are like letting the manufacturer go to other place to reroute the trade to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and one thing that got less attention than it lead to capture is actually China starting to have manufacturing investment into Africa. That South Africa got a lot, and then China starting to build industrial park in one in Ethiopia, for example. So definitely the Chinese manufacturers, in response to the first Trump administration tariff and then the continuous tariff, and the expectation of more tariff coming, then definitely will try to find outlet for their manufacturing investment to continue the trade by a third country, and then the rest of Asia might be eventually affected by tariff, and then the new Trump administration has been talking about at some point universal tariff, but that no specific yet, and right now the new tariff being talked about is against Mexico. Definitely a lot of China investment manufacturing also go to Mexico, and then that they're trying to plug that loophole in some way by tariff against Mexico and Canada and Europe, and then not yet talking about Africa. And so I see that can be potentially an opportunity. That if Africa can avoid all this tariff, and then tariff didn't fall on Africa, then Africa can become even bigger as a kind of attractor of manufacturing investment from China and elsewhere, and then Africa, because eventually development lead industrialization, and you can't develop by just building infrastructures and exporting raw material. Industrialization is often a very big part of development. So if it pay out well, then Africa can somehow benefit in this situation by becoming a kind of a new and up and coming manufacturing powerhouse that is already happening in not a big way, but starting in South Africa, Ethiopia, and many other places that has manufacturing investment from China. So
Thanks. Yun.
Sure. A couple of thoughts. On tariff, I think the tariff war was the escalation of the trade war between US and China is only getting started, right? Trump just announced a second round of additional 10% of tariff on Chinese products, Chinese export to the United States to be going into to be effective by March 4th. So I think we're really at the beginning of this. But what we have seen in the past, I would say a trend in the past 6 years, but accelerated under the Biden administration, is China trying to use backdoor trade into, well, it's not even backdoor trade, it's more China moving a supply chain. So supply chain has shifted. So China is moving its manufacturing industry or manufacturing factories to less developed countries in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, to export indirectly. So the same export indirectly to US market. So the same parts and materials from China are still used for products export to the US, but just not directly. Now this goes through a third country manufacturing center, or whether it's processing trade or it's just well, some would call it like a wash. To become the products of another country. I think that's a trend that we have seen, and it potentially will escalate. So whether US are how is US going to adjudicate on what products will be perceived as Chinese, or what product will be perceived as from the local recipient country? I think that goes to a debate of the rules of origin, right? What percentage of products from percentage of components of our products is from China? What percentage of that is manufactured locally? And what if it is manufactured locally but through Chinese investment? and through a Chinese-owned factory. So I think that's going to go into that debate. AGOA is going to expire by this September, right? During Trump 1, the first term, President Trump did say that he doesn't believe that AGOA should continue because it doesn't work. It doesn't work as good as it could be for the United States. So I don't think we have seen the full play as for what will happen to AGOA, whether it will be terminated or whether it will be revised and reformed to reflect new priorities of the administration. We just don't know. I honestly haven't seen that President Trump's priority coming to the issue of AGOA. But we do know that he also proposed, I believe during the last year of his first administration, he proposed a free trade negotiation with Kenya, something that the Biden administration inherited and turned it into, I believe it's called the strategic STIP, so STIP, and is the U.S. Kenya Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership. But we also know that under Biden administration, a lot of that arrangement is associated with, for example, anti-corruption, environment and climate change actions, and good regulatory policies. So those are unlikely to be President Trump's priority if there is going to be a continuation of this trade negotiation between U.S. and Kenya. And this could potentially be an area that that if there is going to be a free trade agreement between U.S. and Kenya, then I would speculate that U.S. will want to repeat that practice with other key African countries as well. I don't have a lot to add on the arms, the EBA from Europe, but one thing that I do want to mention is that while we have seen an increased or exacerbated level of instability in Africa in the past few years, whether it's civil wars, domestic coups, so we have seen an escalation of instability in the region, but at the same time, we're not necessarily seeing more contribution, for example, troop deployment from either Europe or the United States in the region. I think, in fact, both US and Europe have shown the potential tendency to withdraw their troops further from the African continent. Potentially, there is a speculation that Trump will focus more on the Horn of Africa. Last time he named a special envoy for the Horn, and this time we don't know yet, but Ethiopia, especially the geostrategic location of the Horn, could potentially be a key issue for Africa. But what will be the new priorities of Trump's second term coming to security policies toward Africa, we just don't know yet. Thank you.
Bob, did you have anything to add to the topic of tariffs and
No, certainly.
AGOA?
Certainly, and I'll try and be brief. I know we have a couple of other points of discussion. I think one is that very obviously, if these tariffs are going to have a ripple effect on Africa, with the specific understanding, as mentioned by my colleagues, supply chains are what they are. That no country is fully dependent on itself for just about everything. So, a country like South Africa, which is a manufacturing power of the continent, will have a big challenge just getting, materials for manufacturing if the tariffs hit the countries that supply these materials, such as China, for example. And one can go on and on. I think the other, as far as AGOA is concerned, my colleagues have been a bit cautious, but I think I want to be a little more bold and suggest that AGOA is nearly dead. I think we can revisit this discussion in September. And I say that because, one, when the USA was gutted, down it went with Prosper Africa. Prosper Africa was a kind of whole of government initiative by the Trump administration itself in about 2018, 2019, thereabouts. And it was top heavy with, involvement of DFC, involvement of, Power Africa initiative. In fact, Power Africa was just rescinded only a couple of days back, in fact, early this week. So I think these are, for me, indications that AGOA in its current form of preferential treatment to African goods is not the kind of language we hear from Trump. And I don't see it therefore surviving. I think the other point that has been raised over and over is around the use of AGOA to advance certain American values. For example, nearly 8 countries are on the AGOA sanction list. Many of these African dictators actually celebrated. I was very amused when I saw President Yoweri Museveni being the first one to congratulate Trump on winning and hoping for very good relations. I think they are very mistaken. A transaction of Trump is not going to let them off the hook, AGOA, or anything like that. Rather, he will be like, where is the America first in our relationship? And I think ditto AGOA as well. I think finally, I'll just say that Africans have been working very hard on the African Continental Free Trade Area. There had been indications of negotiations with the US to deal, as a, on a multilateral level almost, rather than bilateral, so that the US economic and trade relations in Africa are channeled through AfCFTA. But I think, as my colleagues have already pointed out, a transaction of Trump will be more in favor of country-to-country relations, where you have much more leverage, rather than bringing together all these 54 African presidents, to negotiate with them as one. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. I want to move on to kind of returning to the discussion around US aid. And in addition to asking my questions, I'm going to just go ahead and ask a question from one of our audience members as it relates to the topic. So Manling Yang asks specifically for Professor Yun Sun, with the withdrawal of the US from Africa foreign aid arena, even though China may not be filling the void left behind according to the numbers, does this mean that China may play a bigger role in shaping the foreign aid regime on the continent or even globally? Part 2 is with US withdrawal. What does the US withdrawal mean to other OEC donors in Africa in terms of losing an important ally? I had some related questions as well. And again, Yun, you can start responding, but again, open to our other panelists as well. One of the things that my colleague Bob Ken Opalo has stated is that in terms of training African specialists in the United States, the emphasis has often been on development, on kind of helping Africa to develop, possibly on governance, but certainly this kind of focus on poverty, crisis, development, and recent report on the from the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, our colleague Zainab Usman's and others questioned this kind of framing of U.S.-Africa relations in kind of this, we must help them, right? We must help them fix the situation. And I think in the China-Africa space, one of the things that we hear quite often, and Bob can confirm this, but is that African leaders actually prefer a Chinese attitude of kind of let's do business, let's look at Africa as potential business partners and as potential market for our goods, rather than this basket case that we need to help. So my question is related to kind of US framing of our relationship with Africa, and if there's a silver lining behind the gutting of aid, Could it possibly mean that we're shifting the framing of how America looks at Africa, not just as a recipient country, from the generous donor countries, but as a potential partner, as beyond resources, as market as well. So let me leave it there. And Yan, if we can start with you.
Sure. A couple of thoughts because I don't think that the whole foreign aid reform campaign here in Washington has completely settled just yet. We've seen a number of things being terminated. We've seen the USAID being gutted. But what's eventually going to happen to the US aid, the foreign aid picture, I think that's still up in the air, right? I think we know that USAID most likely will be reabsorbed back into states. But I think the administration is also going to find out that foreign aid is not something that you can completely eliminate. You still have to do a number of them, whether it's bilateral or it's multilateral. So it's still going to be on the US government policy, I would say playbook. So how is that going to end up? We don't know yet. So I wouldn't say that US, at least for now, I would not draw the conclusion that US is completely withdrawing from the foreign aid arena. But what eventually will be the picture, we just don't know. Is that going to affect the foreign aid regime? I think it depends on which regime you're talking about. Are you talking about a bilateral regime or are you talking about a multilateral regime? Because again, if you look at China's foreign aid budget, it's also divided into bilateral aid and multilateral aid, right? The contribution, for example, to World Bank, and China's share of, for example, is contribution to international development organizations, including, for example, I would say ADB and potentially AIIB. That's all foreign aid budget. So how is US withdrawal going to affect the multilateral foreign aid regime? I think that remains to be seen. The most direct answer is that, well, if US does decide to, for example, decrease its contribution to World Bank, then there will have to be a redistribution of the pie of the commitment, right? According to countries' GDP, according to countries' share. So there will be a redistribution if US chooses to cut its spending or its contribution, but we're not there yet. We are not seeing the Trump administration saying that, well, we're going to reduce or remove our contribution to international development institutions just yet. I think the impact on the bilateral foreign aid, I think that's what people focus most on. And when people talk about is China going to fill the void, they're talking about the bilateral aid. They're not talking about the multilateral. And my argument is that if you look at the amount of Chinese aid and what Chinese aid is used for, bilateral aid, China is not able to fill the void or even cover half of what USAID used to do. OECD, well, China is not a member. Well, there have been all this discussion about that sustainability since COVID and how China is a member of the DSSI, but China is not a member of the Paris Club. I think it achieved the observer status. So there has been this demand to coordinate with China on debt restructuring, on debt basically the resolution of the debt and the increased debt stress of for example, the African continent. But my understanding is that China have opted for bilateral debt restructuring instead of joining a broader, for example, OECD-led the Paris Club style of debt negotiation. So is Europe going to significantly change its approach to aid? So far, we're not seeing that just yet. You could even argue that we have seen from a few European governments since what has happened to USAID panned out. You have seen that some European governments actually increasing their commitment to foreign aid. But you also see the government like UK saying that, well, we want to cut our funding to government grants. So I think that's also a picture that has not settled. On the issue of basically, I think Yun, you asked a great question. That's the philosophy behind foreign aid, right? What are you helping people to do, and how are you helping people to do what you believe that they should be doing? I don't think we're going to see a clear answer to that, because I would argue that other than capacity building, some of the critical materials, medical services, and supplies that U.S. has been supplying to Africa, that's indispensable, right? That cannot be displaced or that cannot be removed because Africa will have the demand in those areas, and those are not business operations. These are human lives that we're talking about. So I feel that we need to be more differentiated about, are we talking about capacity building? And even under capacity building, are we talking about governance training, political training, or are we talking about technical assistance, like training officials to do custom inspections? So I think there's no one answer that can blanketly cover every issue under foreign aid, and that will have to be adjudicated much more carefully. But I agree with you. I think that philosophical debate has always existed. That tension is always there. Thanks.
Bob, let me turn to you.
Okay, I'll make a brief comment on the whole question of the foreign aid architecture, and then transition to the other questions that have been directed at me. And I'll just very say briefly that one of the areas of discussion that has been, in the debate cycles for quite a while now is that Africa does not need aid. What it needs is trade and so forth. But even more recently, there's been very stringent discussions, very well-informed discussions by African governments and intellectuals to try to identify areas in which Africa hemorrhages money. It loses money all the time. And your usual suspects are a couple of factors. One is, climate financing, that, Africa is suffering disproportionately, in terms of, affecting climate change related issues. Issues related to remittances, which are a key source of income for many families and key, sources of foreign income for governments. These are very expensive because when you're wiring money from the US or China, if you're a student there, or Europe, you actually pay an exorbitant kind of charge on that. And if there was any kind of saving on that, countries will make quite a good amount of money out of that. There's been issues of illicit financial flows. And in fact, one of the executive orders that Trump has recently signed talks of posing regulation that kind of banned American companies for involvement in corrupt practices out there. China has actually been fingered quite a bit in the past for this particular ill. I mean, not all Chinese companies, but quite a number of instances of Chinese companies being involved in illicit financial flows that have been mentioned. I mean, of course, I'm not for generalized condemnation of China. I think for those of us who are Africa-China scholars, we know better that there are individual cases and so forth. Of course, in about 10 years ago, there was a big debate around debt trap diplomacy. I mean, of course, there were arguments on both sides of the debate. But I think the more nuanced perspective was like, yes, to some extent, Chinese debt is a problem on the African continent. So is American, so is European. And I think we settled on the fact that I think the Chinese, for the most part, were not going out to use debt as a diplomatic strategy. But yet it still remains, the continent is saddled by huge debt. There are issues to do with tax injustices and so forth. So that if these global financial governance issues were sorted out, African governments will actually have quite a good amount of resources to do their own development, and there will be wind of aid. But anyway, that is the debate around that. I think the question that has been posed to me directly is the formation recently, as recent as last month, in fact, of the alliance of Sahelian states. This is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and with the indications that Senegal might actually join in as well. And these are countries that now are under military rule, They have been kicked out of the African Union as well as ECOWAS, the regional bloc, the economic community of West African states. So how will Trump deal with them? That is a curveball because I think getting a direct answer can be tough. But I'll hazard a guess, and don't hold me to it if it doesn't quite measure up. But if Trump is dealing with Putin, in the case of Putin and Zelensky or Russia, Ukraine, that will indicate that morals are not his strong suit. Rather, where is the money? And now is America first in this deal? So I will not be entirely surprised, although perhaps some figures, politicians, and advisors in the U.S. government might dissuade him. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was a need for uranium, which Niger has in plenty. And Trump thought, look, let's deal on the basis of this. I believe there was one other question which I can't remember fast enough, but I think I'll stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Bob. Ho-fung.
Yeah, just want to add one point that I agree with Yun, that it's still too early to tell whether the Trump administration is really abolishing bilateral aid as we know it. That if you look at the Project 2025 of Heritage Foundation, many people regard as a kind of blueprint of what they are doing now, that they didn't say abolishing aid altogether. They're just saying that to align aid more closely with foreign policy goal. So I can imagine a scenario down the line that they will revive the aid regime, but under tight control of the State Department and serving whatever U.S. foreign policy goal is. But in the short run, that I see that bilateral aid is one of the source of aid. That you also mentioned that actually that this is multilateral aid. Like the United Nations system has been paying in important part, like the UNDP has been collaborating with African Union, have a lot of projects, and AIIB and World Bank also has a lot of co-lending to project to improve access to clean water and green transitions. They have a very broad definition of what is Asia. Actually, it's AIIB, but also the BRIC Bank up and coming and also a player. So this multilateral institution is going to play a part. Of course, then U.S. contribute a lot to this multilateral institution. That it is still uncertain whether Trump will like pull out from this United Nations system, like withdraw from the WHO, which is a big deal that have impact on the resources of this organization. But we'll see. And another third source of aid that we need to pay attention to is the private foundation and nonprofits. They have been playing a big part in the U.S. and a lot of aid is actually funneled through like Gates Foundation. They have a lot of projects in Africa. And in the nonprofit sector in the U.S. and UK, and of course that they have their different set of problem, but actually they are also a key actor depending on private donation and not controlled by the government. So now, in the short run, that people feel the dire situation in terms of aid situation to all these humanitarian crisis and problem in the developing world in Africa, then it might create a space for these private foundations and also non-profit to expand their activities and to diversify the ecology of the aid system in the world, so to speak.
Thank you so much, Ho-fung. I wanted to pick up on kind of the gist of the things that you were saying and push all of you a little bit to tell us what you think is going to happen. But again, in terms of looking at multilaterals and kind of broadening the conversation beyond China, Africa, and the United States, Professor Carmody in the questions asked specifically about Russia. Ho-fung, you mentioned the BRICS countries, but maybe picking up on a question that Yun Sun started out with is, in the arena of aid, but possibly others as well, if the U.S. suddenly kind of cuts kind of their interests or contributions, who's going to step in to kind of fill the void, not just in terms of aid, donations, or contributions, but other sorts of activities. So I want to ask specifically Russia, the BRICS countries, but some of the other African partners that have been much more prominent in the last decade or so, right? Japan, South Korea, Turkey, several of the Arab countries in and some of these are members of the expanded BRICS, but will we see an expansion of this kind of new multipolar, world that people have been talking about? So let me leave it at that. I understand it's very broad, and I understand that again, it's very early days in terms of the Trump administration and what we might see, but I think, we all have the experience of the previous Trump administration and priorities there. Some of you have mentioned already America First, and so let me yeah, stop there. Ask for your views.
Yeah, let me jump in very quickly on one of the points. I can't cover all of it, but pick up on something that Bob mentioned earlier, that actually UAE is becoming a big player also in this in African development as a kind of a source of capital and all kind of work. So we are in a kind of a Trump world, or actually even pre-Trump, that we are entering in the multipolar situation. Definitely, it is not only bipolar. It's not only China and US, but also you have actors like Russia, Turkey, as we mentioned, and also UAE and all these oil-rich Gulf states also has a part to play in Africa. So it's in the development or aids or in the financial front, and BRICS, the BRICS brand that they have set it up, but actually the capitalization is not as expected, and when the BRIC countries keep expanding, to be honest, I fail to keep track of who is in BRICS now. Like they add 3 countries every week, and so it's definitely more difficult to put the act together with more country involved. And another, speaking of Russia, another part of the outside power involvement in Africa is the security. That we know that Russia, a big part of it is the Wagner Group, the mercenary that actually is active in intervening in some local conflicts, and primarily tied to the access and control to natural resources in Africa. And also Russia is not, and the Wagner Group is not the only one, and there's an emerging phenomena that China has also a lot of private security firm now that like 10 years ago, people pay attention to Eric Prince, who actually hired by a Chinese state-owned company to run these security operations in Africa, and now expand to Belt and Roads in general to protect China interests in Africa. So all these private securities firms from Russia, and increasingly also from China, is also going to complicate the scene of the security in Africa, and how the U.S. is going to respond to it. Or actually, the U.S. has some military operation here and there in Africa that didn't get a lot of public attention, but there's some special operations and here and there as well, but not very big. But then it is very complicated situation there. And another thing that has been mentioned in passing is the UN peacekeeping force as well. That while US and Europe tend to contribute less and less, and China is actually increasing its presence in Africa through its contribution to UN peacekeeping. So China influence is not only in economic and finance and infrastructure and all that, but also in security and peacekeeping. Let me end here.
Great. Yun.
Just some quick thoughts. I think one, just 2 quick thoughts. The first one is the question of contribution to what, right? Are we talking about economy? Are we talking about security? Are we talking about development? Are we talking about politics? So I don't think there's, again, one blanket conclusion that we can draw that well, this is what's going to happen to this field. And 2, I think it's also about scale, right? It's all relative. US withdraws, and it doesn't mean that US is no longer the biggest elephant in the room. But even if US withdraws most of the aid to Africa, I would say that US still has a exceedingly large influence over the future of the continent. So although we are seeing that there is a trend for multilateral or multipolarization, we're seeing more actors being surfacing. to the whole landscape as new players. But if we compare the role they play, what they're doing, like Bob said, where's the money, and what is your real contribution? Then we're looking at very different pictures, right? There are some countries that's more rhetorical, some countries are more involved in diplomatic engagements. But I would say by the end of the day, coming to Africa, the key issue being economic development, the economic future of the continent, it still comes down to what is the real resources that you're allocating towards the continent to foster the growth and the capacity of the continent. So this expansion of multipolar world, I think it is true, but I think it also requires a qualitative, almost a note that this change has not overwhelmed or categorically changed the power distribution among the key countries or the key players in the room. So more players does not necessarily mean that the previous landscape has completely been overruled. Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks, you. Let me jump in with just a couple of thoughts as well. And one, I think I'll start with some, a paradox that has arisen with Trump's withdrawal from UN agencies specifically. WHO, the Paris Accord on climate change, the so-called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Human Rights Council, and so forth. And of course, the siege on WTO, courtesy of the tariffs. It's quite interesting because when this happened in Trump 1, President Xi Jinping and China more broadly, stepped up to the plate and said, we are for multilateralism. And of course, Africans love multilateralism because if you are a small, tiny player, you like to have a global stage. And so that's the paradox here is that while that is happening, we have these new formations which operate alongside or outside of the UN system, which is an antithesis to official quote unquote global governance through the UN, which we all as humanity understand is a global government. This is the BRICS, which as I think Ho-fung had to chuckle a bit when you said you lose count of who is the new member. There's almost a new member. In fact, now the new members are being called, BRICS Plus rather than BRICS members. I think there's Uganda, Nigeria, and so forth. And a few other countries are lining up to join. So these formations are okay, but what then happens to multilateralism that is nearly official, where treaties and so forth can be handled? Just this week, we have the G20 ministerial meetings here in Johannesburg. And, and this has been for 2 weeks. Last week, there was the, foreign ministers meeting. Great attendance by almost all the countries except the US, which was represented by the charge d'affaires, or the deputy ambassador for that matter. Whereas, Foreign Minister Wang Yi was here, Lavrov was here, and so forth. But this week, when the finance ministers and governors of central banks met, quite a number of them skipped. Quite interestingly, the Chinese skipped, EU skipped, the British were not in town. So I think this starts to tell you that you have political, kind of geopolitical solidarity, but when it comes to, because of course the G20 is there is key track. There are 2 tracks, of course, but the key track is a financial one, and that is reform of global governance, reform of financial governance, which the countries like China, the US, Europe do not want to hear, through. And so therefore there are multiple paradoxes there that we talk of solidarity within small formations, because if you're talking of the G20, where do the rest of the 192 member countries go if they are not in that formation? If you are thinking the BRICS, then where do you want the other countries to go? If you are then not doing things at the UN level, then it becomes a little problematic, at least for me. I think just one last point, Yun, is that, and it's just an amusement, perhaps something we need to take note of, is that Trump declared that should the BRICS go the route of de-dollarization, that is the use of currencies other than the dollar, he will slap those countries with 100% tariffs. Now, if that was to happen, I wonder if that has actually encouraged these countries to slow down on that kind of rhetoric. Because in the recent past, I haven't seen much news in that direction. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I just make a
go
quick
ahead,
comment
Yan.
about that BRIC currency issue? Again, I think we have to be specific about what currency is being used among whom, right? We know that China and Russia have been using their own currency for transactions, so rubles and RMB for transactions since the beginning of the Ukraine war. So in a way, you could say that some BRICS countries are already doing that. But on the other hand, I think the negotiation between China and Saudi to use currency other than US dollars for their oil transactions, that negotiation has been going on forever. I don't think Saudi Arabia is going to adopt that anytime soon. So I think that, again, it goes into the specifics. Does Trump mean that all BRICS countries starts to use one currency among themselves? Or is some members of BRICS countries using a currency that's other than US dollars among between themselves? And what would trigger that U.S. reaction? So all of those are not clear. So which means that it doesn't mean that his threat is not credible, but it does mean that there are many layers of caveats that you can go into to deliberate and see which one really triggers the reaction.
Thank you. We're running short on time. There's one question from the audience that we haven't gotten to, and I had one more question. So I'm going to read the question from the audience member and give you my last question as well. We'll do one final round if each of you could just choose which question you want to respond to, and we'll do one final round. But Mr. Oginga asked another trade question to follow up on the AGOA discussion. And that is, how is, if AGOA is not renewed and the EU deforestation-free regulation has gone into effect, which has gone into effect, how is this going to affect Sino-African trade relations or China's export of its overcapacity to Africa? And he makes a good point here is that China has been the leading trade partner for 15 years despite the existence of AGOA. So that's the question from Yosan Oginga. And I wanted to follow up, Yun, particularly with you, but I'm sure Ho-fung and Bob might have something to add, but about this conversation on critical minerals. And as you discussed it, this may very well become the next big area of competition between US and China in Africa. And that raises all kinds of red flags for me, in particular when we see that, there are large chunks of the DRC that are already in tremendous conflict. And so my question is, if this does in fact become the next area of competition, how will the various actors address the dire human rights and labor conditions that are already taking place, as well as the environmental impacts and costs of this competition? It strikes me as a huge problem, not just in DRC, but in many African countries that we will ignore to our own peril. So let me leave it there. If you guys can each take about 90 seconds, that would be great. Thank you. Bob, go ahead and start.
Sure. Thanks. I think to the question of what happens if AGOA is not renewed, I think, first of all, I would like to appreciate that question because before the election of Trump, quite a number of countries that relations with the US had actually prepared. African countries were not prepared. Um, and I think you saw the response of the Chinese, the Europeans, and so forth when the new foreign policy actions, executive orders started rolling in. They were ready with responses pretty fast. Which suggests that they had been gotten flat-footed in 2016, 2017. And this time around, they were like, we are dealing with an unpredictable situation, but you have to simulate potential scenarios and be ready. So I think it's important for African countries not to wait for the fact, but to look at the possibility of a continuation of AGOA in its current form, which is unlikely, or to look at a recalibration, kind of a reformulation of AGOA, and consider various possibilities, and also equally be prepared, or in fact prepare for the very worst case scenario, which is that AGOA is gone. So what do you do? And I think if you looked at that, if I was in the room kind of throwing in my 2 pence, I will suggest that looking at China alone is not sustainable. I think we've already rehashed and talked quite a bit about China's own calculations, China's own objectives, which are very pragmatic. The fact that the Chinese economy has shifted, meaning that the kinds of exports you send are not going to be agricultural products that are unfinished or any number of other African products. The fact that even if the Chinese were our best buddies, they are not going to be able to absorb all our goods. And I think that will then suggest that you have to also look at other strategies, value addition, which has been a song for years. Look at other markets, some of them very close to the continent, if you are in the Horn of Africa, across the Red Sea and so forth. And I think that would be my contribution to that. Thank you. Yeah.
Ho-fung.
Yeah, that quick response. And first, the trade with China. China is a manufacturing powerhouse, very powerful industrial entity. And then whoever trading with China encountered the similar problem of the so-called China shocks. And no matter whether you are African countries or US or Europe, that you trade with China, that you import a lot of industrial product from China, and then China lead your raw material. Even like US is becoming a raw material exporter to China with soybeans and meat and all this and importing. So it is the problem is universal. So now many developing countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia has this dilemma. On the one hand, geopolitically, they are tempted to align with China to hedge against the US, and at the same time, economically, that they face the similar situation of US and other countries trading with China, that is the fear of the industrialization or have their industry development impeded. So it is a dilemma that there's a kind of a opportunity that Africa actually can work with other countries, including the US, to deal with this China manufacturing challenge. Food tariff, actually, that tariff is not to cut off the tie, but actually you can increase the incentive for China to rather than exporting manufactured product to your country, but to invest in your country to make the stuff in the country that increase employment. The second thing is about critical mineral. That actually critical mineral and rare earth, there are a lot of things that actually concentrate in certain places. Actually, there's a lot of places also have this critical minerals and rare earth. So there are actually a lot where even the US has a lot of deposit of this critical mineral. The issue is that there's a huge environmental and labor right cost to mining it. So now the situation is that whoever who has lax environmental and labor standards, they can mine it in a kind of a cheap way. So it is the issue that come in. That the issue that you mentioned is very right. That if Africa become a hotbed of critical mineral mining, then it will have a lot of environmental issues, labor right issues that we need to address, and not only about where to find the stuff, but also how to mine it in a kind of a framework that is not environmentally and in a human rights sense detrimental. That's my 2 cents on this.
A quick comment on the trade. So yes, we have been hearing about China has been the leading trading partner of Africa since I believe 2009, right? So it has been consistent, a trend. And the implied criticism on the US is that, well, why are you not trading with Africa more? And my response to that is you also have to look at the composition of the trade, right? You have to look at what China is importing from Africa, which is primarily raw materials. And you could argue that, what does that really help African economy to grow to its next phase? And then you look at how basically the reversal of the trade pattern between China and Africa. China has also, one thing that I don't think Africa mentions as much is that China has also been consistently running a trade surplus against Africa. And that trade surplus only keeps growing, which means that China is buying less from Africa comparing to what it is selling to Africa. So I feel that, again, a blanket statement does not help. You have to look at the composition and look at the pattern, look at where Africa stands. Currently, for 2024, Africa runs a $60 billion trade deficit vis-a-vis China. And what does that mean for the local economy, right? We know that China still primarily imports raw materials from Africa, and at the same time exports textile, clothes, machineries, and appliances to Africa. So you could say, well, yeah, those two economies are mutually complementary, and you could criticize that why U.S. has not developed more mutual complementarity with African economy. But I also would advocate that, well, let's not romanticize China's economic relationship with Africa, and let's look at the reality and see what's the implication of that. The impact of AGOA, as long as most of the Chinese export to Africa is not re-exported, meaning that China is not using process trade or processing trade, or using Africa as a backdoor to U.S. market, I wouldn't think that for example, the termination of AGOA is going to have a significant impact on this particular aspect. Because if what China exports to Africa is consumed locally and is not for backdoor trade to the US market, then the termination of AGOA does not necessarily have an impact over that. But then it gets into a debate as for what AGOA has really contributed in terms of growing Africa export to the United States. And there's a lot of criticism on that too. So again, there's always a front story, and then you look underneath. There's more, there's more stories to it. And again, I would caution against just blanket romanticized view of any trade relationship. On the issue of critical minerals and mining, I think you're absolutely correct. You're Yun, I'm Yun, and sorry, I'm a little confused. You're absolutely correct. I think the labor, environmental, and social impact of the Chinese enhanced mining engagement in Africa, I think that's an issue that has, well, I would say maybe 10 years ago, there were a lot of focus on what the Chinese are doing in terms of mining sector in Africa. But then that died down quite a bit, right? Now with the renewal of interest in mining of critical minerals in Africa, I suspect that's going to come up as a sticking issue again. But the problem is, well, let's think about it. If US is not, we don't even believe in climate change anymore. If we are less stringent about domestic governance record in African countries, then I would say that U.S. will not this time around be the watchdog against what China is doing. Well, a lot of the USAID projects, for example, helping civil society, investigative journalism in Africa, so those have had an effect over how they shape the investment environment for Chinese companies operating in the mining sector. But now if all those are gone, I would say, well, less watchdogs and much less monitoring and much less civil society vigilance against this type of projects. But then again, the card or the ball is in African court, I would say at this point, that eventually this is African countries' decision, this is their land, this is their decision. But for international community, we can watch, we can analyze, but eventually the decision is with Africa. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists and to the audience members who are still with us 5 minutes after our official end time. I want to thank you all for being here. I appreciate that this is the beginning of a conversation and that perhaps we now have even more questions than we have answers. But I think this is an important conversation that we need to keep having. We've talked about a lot of different topics. And again, I want to thank our experts, Yun Sun from the Stimson Center, Ho-fung from Johns Hopkins University, and Bob Wakeza from the University of the Witwatersrand. Thank you so much for lending your expertise and your insights to our audiences. We have several more events coming up in the near future. For those of you who are in the Washington, D.C. area, we're going to be hosting Professor Mingwei Huang from Dartmouth on March 20th, and she'll be talking about her new book, Reconfiguring Racial Capitalism, South Africa in the Chinese Century. A lot of thought-provoking things just in the title of her book. On April 4th, we'll be co-sponsoring an event with the U.S. Institute of Peace, featuring some research of new young African scholars who've been working on research projects that they're just completed and presented last week in Abuja. We'll have 4 of them presenting their work, looking at Chinese engagements in three or 4 different African countries and the impacts on peace and security. And finally, at the end of April, we'll be hosting a spring symposium that will be hybrid and focus on digital engagements between China and Africa. So we hope you'll be joining us for those events. Please watch the space. We'll send out mailers. Again, thank you to the Ford Foundation and to our co-sponsors and to all of you for being here. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again.